Hi, everybody. Welcome to Chapter 3. Today, we will go over physical and cognitive development in infancy. First, let's go over height and weight of infants. So the average American newborn is 20 inches long and weighs 7.6 pounds. I know I was heavier than that as a baby. And then babies grow about 1 inch per month during their first year. By 2 years of age, infants weigh approximately 26 to 32 pounds, and they are about 32 to 35 inches in height. Interestingly, growth is episodic during this time, which means it happens in spurts. It's not gradual, it happens in big spurts. So all of a sudden, you kind of really grow quickly. The brain has very rapid and extensive growth throughout infancy, more so than any other period of our lifetime. The brain is also very vulnerable to shaken baby syndrome during this time, which we will talk about today. And it's really important the environment that you grow up in when it comes to brain development. The environment can really help or hinder your brain development. So children who grew up in a deprived environment, like a Romanian orphanage, may have depressed brain activity. In a Romanian orphanage, you might not be getting adequate food, but also just attention or love, like you might with other types of caregivers, right? And your brain might be really hindered because you're not getting that stimulation from your environment. The good news is your brain is really flexible and resilient the younger you are. One example of this is Michael Rabin's. He had uncontrollable seizures, and doctors actually removed his whole left hemisphere. That means half of his brain was removed. Because he was young, the other half of his brain that he still had was able to make up for the functions of the part of the brain that they took out. His brain was really flexible and resilient because he was young. Sleep is really important for development in newborns. That's why they sleep so much. A typical newborn sleeps approximately 16 to 17 hours a day. That's a lot. Some infants do have sleep-related problems, about 15 to 25%, and this includes nighttime waking, more so than we would expect, and this is really linked to separation distress or anxiety, so having anxiety or stress because you're separated from your caregiver. Sleeping arrangements also change depending on different cultural backgrounds. In some cultures, infants sleep in the same beds as their caregivers. In some cultures, it's different rooms. It really depends from culture to culture. REM is an important part of sleep. REM stands for rapid eye movement. This rapid eye movement, you can kind of tell even when someone is sleeping. You can look at their eyelids when they're closed and see their eyes rapidly moving. So REM is a stage of sleep. And for infants, REM is very important, so it actually makes up about half of an infant's sleep. The rest of your lifespan, you do not get this much REM sleep. And people say that this may be why infants' brains develop so quickly, is because they're having so much REM sleep. It's really good for their brains. It's like food for their brains. Sleep has been really linked to cognitive development. This is for every stage of life, but definitely for infants. And this is probably because sleep plays a role in brain maturation, so the development of the brain, and memory consolidation. So when you have good sleep, you have better memory, language, and executive functioning. Lower quality of sleep is linked to the opposite. So low quality sleep is linked to distractibility and behavior problems. Sleep could also be linked to sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS, which we are going to talk about a lot today. So what is SIDS? SIDS is when an infant suddenly dies without an apparent cause. There are many recommendations for infant sleep to reduce the risk of SIDS. Doctors have lots of rules and recommendations in order to try and prevent SIDS, or the sudden infant death syndrome. There's lots of research on risk factors for SIDS, which are listed on this slide, and these are just some of them. So just pointing out a couple, having a sibling who died of SIDS, being of lower socioeconomic status, maternal smoking, these are just some of them. But in general, we tend to focus on risk factors that we have some control over. So let's focus on those. So what do we have control over? Sometimes we have control over breastfeeding. So infants who are breastfed are less likely to have SIDS. We have control over, the sleeping arrangements. So sleeping in a bedroom with a fan and sleeping on your back means you're less likely to have SIDS. So those are recommendations right now. Nutrition is a really important part of development for infants. In general, infants should consume about 50 calories per day for every pound they weigh. So this is going to increase with time because they're going to start weighing more. And eating changes with development. With infants, they don't have a lot of motor skills, and they slowly start to gain motor skills that make it easier to eat. So they start by doing things like sucking and swallowing, and they're not able to chew, but eventually they're going to start to learn to chew. They might be able to start using their hands to pick up foods. These are all skills that they learn over time. And so until they have those motor skills, the food that they eat needs to be congruent to the development that they are working on. So you're not going to be giving chips to a baby that can't chew, that doesn't have the finger mobility and the dexterity to pick up chips. That's not something that you're going to be doing. And research also says it's important to have a really varied diet from an early age, so introducing fruits and vegetables early is really good for babies. With baby nutrition, one way to feed babies is through breastfeeding, and another way is through bottle feeding. Now, both of these are great because both of these get a baby fed, but research says that there are some pros and cons to each of these methods. So breastfeeding is technically better for a baby's health. You can see here there's a lot of benefits for breastfeeding. Less gastrointestinal infections, respiratory infections, ear infections. When a baby is breastfed, they actually get all of the immunities that the mother has passed on through the breast milk. Even long term, a baby may be less likely to become overweight in childhood, adolescence, adulthood if they were breastfed as babies. And they're also less likely to have SIDS, like we talked about. It's also can be healthy for the mother to breastfeed. There's a lower incidence of breast cancer and ovarian cancer and reduced rate of type 2 diabetes. But breastfeeding isn't going to work for everybody. What's most important is getting a baby fed. That is what is the most important. So a mother shouldn't breastfeed if they're infected with HIV or another infectious disease, if they have tuberculosis, if they're taking any drug. But also keep in mind that breastfeeding can be physically and emotionally difficult. And so some mothers may choose not to breastfeed because it really doesn't work with their lifestyle. It doesn't work with their lifestyle to be pumping, or maybe it might be really physically demanding or painful even. And so it's really important for each mother to decide what works best for her as an individual. And although there is a good amount of research on the benefits of breastfeeding, this research isn't perfect. So these last 2 points here, just what I want you to take away is the research isn't perfect. We can't prove that breastfeeding is good. We just have research to suggest that it's good. Overall, nutrition is a major problem in infancy across the world. In developing countries, They don't have access to clean water and milk. There may be high rates of HIV, and for these reasons, nutrition across the world is not adequate for infants. And not having adequate nutrition in infancy leads to problems. Physical, social, and cognitive development are impaired. There's attention deficits, even later in life, just because you had malnutrition in infancy. And so it's really important that we're paying attention to this problem. Our brain development, all of our development in infancy sets the stage for the rest of our development. So it's important that we're really paying attention to this stage. Now let's talk about motor development. The dynamic systems theory is a theory about how infants assemble their motor skills, their motor development. Dynamic systems theory says that motor skills are developed by maturation and development of the nervous system, which is maturing as we get older, and the body's physical properties. So, for example, physical strength and its potential for movement, which again develops as we get older. And these last two are very important. A child's motivation to reach a new goal is going to influence their motor development. Are they really motivated to start walking? They're probably going to walk faster if they're motivated. And then the last one, also very important, is environmental support for the skill. Do they have a lot of support from their environment, their caregivers, to start walking? They'll probably start walking faster if they have that support. Reflexes have to do with our motor skills. Reflexes are built-in reactions to stimuli, and these govern the newborn's movements because we're all born with these reflexes. They're automatic. We don't have to learn them. In fact, they're kind of out of our control. One reflex, if you ever go to the doctor, is they'll tap your knee, and your reflex is that your foot is going to shoot out. You're going to kick your leg, and that is a reflex we have no control over. As newborns, we have a couple reflexes. We have a rooting reflex. This is when you stroke an infant's cheek or the side of the mouth is touched, and they're going to turn their head towards that touch. The reason for this reflex is to try and get them closer to food. So they're looking for something to suck. They automatically are looking and turning towards that stimuli because there might be nutrition and food there. Another really important reflex infants have is a sucking reflex. This is when newborns automatically suck anything that is placed into their mouth, or they may even take things and put them into their mouth to suck. And this is, again, because they have, this drive to get nutrition. So it's automatic that they always are trying to find things to suck in order to get nutrition and nourishment. And it's also a way to soothe themselves. Because it's so important for them to get nutrition, their bodies tell them that sucking things feels good. And so then it ends up soothing them and it kind of de-stresses them. The Moro reflex is a startle response. So whenever there's a sudden, intense noise or movement, you'll notice that an infant throws their head back, flings out their arms and legs, and arches their back, and then contracts. It almost looks kind of like a bug. They contract. And people say that this reflex might be that infants are trying to grab for support while they're falling. So it's a reflex to try and keep them safe. They are born with this reflex to try and keep them safe. They're also born with a grasping reflex. This is when anything touches an infant's palms, they respond by grasping tightly. And they have a really tight grip, surprisingly. Infants are also starting to develop gross motor skills as part of their physical development. Gross motor skills involve large muscle activities like walking, whereas fine motor skills, we'll go over in a minute, involves much smaller muscles, such as learning how to grab something or learning how to write with your hands. So posture is actually a gross motor skill. And that's because it's involving a lot of parts of the body, a lot of large muscle groups, sensory information, which tells you where you are in space. And so when you first meet an infant, you'll notice they can't even hold their own head up, right? They don't have those gross motor skills to hold posture yet. So some of the other gross motor skills they're working on are walking or standing. Babies can stand by around 10 to 12 months. They can start alternating leg movements and balance on one leg without falling. Learn safe spaces and surfaces to walk on and avoid unsafe spaces. And overall, they're just practicing these new motor skills. Here are some developmental milestones we tend to expect in the first year: grasping, rolling, sitting, crawling, standing, and walking. Infants who reach these milestones earlier tend to be larger at birth, overall size increasing over the first year, and they tend to be breastfed. But this varies from infant to infant by around 2 to 4 months. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be behind for life if they're behind on these milestones. In the second year, gross motor skills really improve. Toddlers, by 13 to 18 months, they can pull a toy, they can climb steps. 18 to 24 months, they can walk quickly or even run, balance on their feet while squatting, walk backward, kick a ball, throw a ball, they can jump. It's kind of terrifying, these tiny humans, what they can do already. So that was gross motor skills. Think big muscle groups, big movements. Now let's go to fine motor skills. This is more finely tuned movements, such as finger dexterity. Infants actually work on a pincer grip. This is a fine motor skill. This is grasping small objects with your thumb and forefinger. So whenever you're grabbing things with those two fingers, that's actually something we learn as infants. Let's start getting into some cognitive development. Let's talk about sensation and perception. They sound similar, but they're actually a little different. Sensation is when information interacts with sensory receptors. Sensation, think of your senses. Eyes, ears, tongues, nostrils, and skin. So things we hear, we touch, we see, etc. Perception is our interpretation of what is sensed. So hearing something is a sensation. Perceiving that you heard an ambulance and that there's an emergency, that is a perception. So it's interpreting the sensory information. So we can study infant perception using something called the visual preference method. This determines whether infants can distinguish one thing from another thing by measuring the length of time that they're looking or attending or hearing a different stimuli. So specifically, we're going to be talking about habituation and dishabituation. And hopefully this will make sense in just a second. Habituation is decreased responsiveness to a stimulus after repeated presentations of the stimulus. So an example would be, okay, you are really excited about these new shoes the first time you wear them, but you repeat that presentation of the shoes over time, you wear them a lot, right? And then you're getting less excited. You have decreased responsiveness. Now, dishabituation is recovery of a habituated response after a change in stimulation. So for example, say that you're listening to music, repeated presentations of that music, and you start to get used to it. You start to get habituated. You start to not pay attention because it starts to become background noise. You're habituated. But then if you change the stimulation, the volume is turned up, you start to pay attention more, right? So with infants, we can see habituation and dishabituation to see if they can distinguish from one stimulus or another. So if they're habituated to a stimulus, we're going to see that they start to not pay attention to a stimulus. If they're dishabituated, they're going to start paying attention all of a sudden. And this lets us know, what are they perceiving, So if all of a sudden they're starting to dance around, we know that they're perceiving some music, right? So habituation and dishabituation is how we try to see what are infants perceiving, because we can't read their minds and they can't talk. So this is the best that we can do to see how are they perceiving the world. So let's talk about visual perception. Vision clarity improves from fuzzy at 1 month old to clear at 1 year. So that's a big piece of development. Within hours of birth, newborns prefer looking at faces over other objects. So for some reason, their perception is really drawn to the faces, probably because they are dependent on other people to take care of them. So their natural tendency is to turn towards faces and to recognize faces. Color vision is also developing. So by 4 to 8 weeks, color vision develops, and by 4 months, babies prefer really saturated colors. This means really bright colors. Here you can see how vision goes from fuzzy to really clear. And now we're going to go over probably the most important part of the lecture today, the visual cliff experiment. And I say that because this is a really famous experiment. And so I want you guys to really understand what happened in this experiment and what it means. So I'm going to describe the experiment. In the experiment, babies were presented with a situation that looks like a cliff, but it's not actually a cliff. It's one of those situations that kind of tricks your mind, tricks your perception. So in the experiment, they want to get to their toy, but the toy is on the other side of the cliff. In the experiment, if the caregiver looks really encouraging and happy, the baby trusts that the cliff is safe and that they can cross it. If the caregiver looks scared and fearful, the baby does not cross the cliff. So this looks like a cliff, it looks scary, and what matters is, are they picking up on caregiver fear or caregivers trusting the situation? Ultimately, the caregiver's facial expressions and emotions are the most important teaching tools for infants. And that's what we get from this experiment. That's the takeaway here, is that as infants are learning perception and what's safe and what's not safe, caregivers' facial expressions and emotions are the most important tools. That's how infants learn. So here's a picture of the visual cliff. So you can see, to a baby, this looks like it's a cliff. To us who have, seen these tricky situations, we can tell that it's probably not a cliff. There's a link at the bottom of this to see a video of this experiment, and I really want you guys to watch it because this visual cliff experiment is a really important experiment in psychology. Other senses are developing in infancy. Changes in hearing. So as infants age, sensitivity increases to loudness, to pitch, to localization. So their hearing is getting better. And then newborns are sensitive to touch and pain, smell and taste. So some of these senses we're born with, and some of them definitely get better with time. So now we're going to get into a major theory of cognitive development, Piaget's theory of infant development and cognitive development. And this is just a visual of the different stages throughout our lives that we go through according to Piaget. So from birth to 2 years of age, the sensory motor stage on the left, then the pre-operational stage, then the concrete operational stage, and then the formal operational stage. So starting in infancy, according to Piaget, we're already starting some cognitive processes like creating schemes. Schemes are actions or mental representations that organize knowledge. These can be behavioral schemes or mental schemes. So an idea of a scheme would be, we have a mental representation of organized knowledge of what is a dog, right? So we organize our knowledge and we say, okay, a dog is furry, a dog barks, a dog has 4 legs. That is our scheme of a dog. A cat is furry, it meows, it's really agile, it has 9 lives. That's a scheme for a cat. We've organized our knowledge to create a mental representation of this concept. Think of a scheme as like a concept. And there's a really good video on this slide that I want you guys to watch on schemes. We create schemes as infants and the rest of our lives through assimilation and accommodation. So assimilation is learning new information to add to your schemes. So for example, if I had a scheme of a dog, and then I saw, oh, here's a bunch of dogs. Some of them have tails and some of them don't. Okay, I'm going to add some information that some dogs don't have tails, right? Adding information. Or accommodation is kind of similar, adjusting schemes to fit new information and experiences. So for a cat, if I all of a sudden meet, a cat that doesn't have fur, I might adjust my scheme to say, not all cats have fur, some cats have fur. So assimilation and accommodation are really similar. And it's okay if you don't understand like the slight differences, but basically it's just how we form our schemes. We adjust and we add information to our concepts, to our schemes. And that's all you need to know from this. So according to Piaget, infants are in the sensory motor stage. This is the first stage of Piaget's cognitive developmental stages, and it lasts from birth to about 2 years of age. In this stage, infants are constructing an understanding of the world by coordinating their sensory experiences. Their senses are strong, their eyes, their ears, they're able to sense a lot of things. But they're using that to construct an understanding of the world. That's what's really developing here. Here's another really important slide from today's class. In the sensory motor stage, Piaget says that you start to learn object permanence. And this is a really important concept. Object permanence is something that we learn. It's when we learn that objects and events continue to exist even if we can't see them anymore. So even when we can't see, hear, or touch them, and this is something that we are not born with, we learn this. So an example would be a baby who understands object permanence, who learns this, would know that in this picture, the blue monkey is right behind that paper. It saw the blue monkey. It sees that there's a paper in front of it. It can no longer see the blue monkey, but it knows that it's still there. And as infants, we don't know this. This is something we learn. We learn object permanence. Piaget also says that infants learn the A not B error in the sensory motor stage. This occurs when infants make the mistake of selecting a familiar hiding place rather than the new hiding place. So I recommend watching the video to really see this. But basically, if I had a cookie and I was hiding it in my left hand, and I showed the infant it was in my left hand, and then I hid it in my left hand, and the infant chose that familiar hiding place, that's good. But then if I change it to my right hand and I show them, but they continue to choose my left hand, even though I showed them that new information, they have not passed the A not B error. In order to progress through the sensory motor stage, infants have to really learn this A not B error. And so I recommend watching this video to really see that happen. So language is also an important part of development in infancy. Language is a form of communication. It's spoken, it's written, it's signed, it's based on a system of symbols, and it lets us pass along information, so it's really important. Here's how language develops in infancy. First, infants start to recognize language sounds. Then they start babbling and having other vocalizations like crying, googling, babbling. They start having gestures like showing or pointing, using their bodies. And then they have first words. It tends to be receptive vocabulary. That receptive vocabulary considerably exceeds spoken vocabulary. So receptive vocabulary means they can hear and understand words, but they may not be necessarily able to speak them yet. So they can hear and understand more than they can speak. And vocabulary comes in spurts, just like our height comes in spurts. So all of a sudden, 1 week you're going to have, 5 new words, and then you'll go weeks without any new words. Infants develop their language by playing around with it. So these are all types or ways that infants play with language. They use overextension, applying a word to objects that are inappropriate for the word's meaning. So they may point to, everything and call it a dog. They point to a car, they point to you, they point to a cookie, and they say it's a dog. They may use underextension, applying a word too narrowly. So they'll be looking at a dog and say, no, that's not a dog. So they're underextending. They use vocalizations to really kind of play around and try out new sounds and words. They use 2-word utterances. This is really common. So they'll say things like, I hungry, dog white, mom bad. And that's how they talk at this age and how they kind of try on words. And at this age, they're really using telegraphic speech. This is using short, precise words without grammatical markers and other things. So they're not using words like the, they're not using a lot of verbs. They're using things like 2-word utterances, I hungry, mom bad. All right, and just a quick review, here are some of the language milestones to look out for during this time. So from birth, we expect that infants should be crying, and then from all the way up to 18 to 24 months, they're using those 2-word utterances, and they're rapidly expanding their understanding of words. So you can take a look at this. And that's where I'm going to end it for today. Thank you so much for putting up with my voice, and I'm going to continue resting so that we can get back into having fun all together as a group. All right? Sounds good.